You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I am a scientist. I am a scientist. I am a scientist. We gotta live on science alone.
Welcome to Unbiased Science, where we bring scientific method to the madness. I'm your host, Dr. Jessica Steyer, a public health scientist. And today I am joined by the amazing Meghann Featherstun to talk about something that I have been asked about, hundreds, if not thousands of times at this point. Specifically, we're going to talk about the docuseries on Netflix called You Are What You Eat. So we'll get into that shortly. But the overarching topic is going to be vegan diets and whether they are better for us than an omnivorous diet. We've talked separately about the carnivore diet and have talked about the harms of eating an exclusively carnivorous diet. So if you want information on that, you can go check that out. But like I said, today we're going to talk about this docuseries. So before we get into things, I'd love to introduce Meghann. So Meghann Featherstun is a sports dietitian, wellness coach, runner, wife, mom of 2 kiddos, and a full-blown nutrition geek and running freak. Those are her words. Her passion is helping people find their own personal balance of nutrition and fitness in their busy lives. And for the last 15 years, she's been working with people to help them find their happy place with nutrition, exercise, body composition, and life. So I'll link to her website in the show notes, but her website is Featherstone Nutrition, and you can also follow her on Instagram at Featherstone Nutrition. Again, you can find all of this in the show notes. Meghann, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm glad to be here. Can't wait to chat some more.
So I have to share, Meghann, that we had to reschedule the last time that we had planned to record. There were things that cropped up for both of us, but Meghann was just casually running a marathon in Tokyo. I think you said you flew 15 hours to go run. Yeah. Meanwhile, I got winded just climbing up the stairs.
Yeah. It was wild. I'm like talking to my kids as I'm going to bed and they're eating breakfast, ready to go to school. I'm like, it was just wild. It was a crazy experience, but really cool.
I love that the wild part for you was the time difference. For me, it would have been the actual marathon, but all right. All right. So let me just set the stage here a little bit. For folks who are not familiar, You Are What You Eat is a docuseries on Netflix that explores the link between diet and health. So the premise centers around a twin experiment, and we're going to actually dive into the study that this is based on momentarily. But the show centers around a scientific experiment involving pairs of identical twins. One twin adopts a vegan diet while the other adopts an omnivorous diet. So the goal is to analyze how these different dietary changes impact various health markers over 8 weeks. So a very key theme that's pervasive throughout the docuseries is that it advocates for plant-based diets and highlights potential health benefits, which we will get into, which they cite are reduced cholesterol and improved gut health. This series also criticizes the rise of ultra-processed foods and factory farming. We've talked about processed foods previously on the podcast, and I have some content planned on some new studies that have come out. So let's table that for the time being. So Meghann, maybe we can kick things off with a discussion of the Stanford Twin Study, since that was sort of the impetus behind the docuseries. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. So this was an 8-week study. It was published at the end of 2023. Of course, I'll link to it in our show notes. It used 22 pairs of twins to determine the cardiometabolic effects of a vegan diet versus an omnivore diet. So over the course of 8 weeks, investigators monitored indicators of cardiovascular health, metabolic status, and gut microbiome via poop and blood samples. I found this this great quote while I was preparing for this. Abby Langer, who's another amazing dietitian, she did a deep dive on this docuseries, and we'll link to it. But I just want to read this review that she posted. So she said, dietitians everywhere release a collective sigh every time Netflix releases a nutrition documentary, and with good reason. Historically, these docs are full of bias, bad data, and sensationalism, none of which actually helps anyone take charge of their health. Like I always say, misinformation doesn't empower anyone, just the opposite, actually. So, Meghann, does that ring true for you?
Oh, it sure does. And I've followed Abby for a very long time on social media, and I think she never minces words. She cuts to the chase and, really says it how it is. And, it is very true. I think we have to remember, who is sponsoring these docuseries, what's the mission of these docuseries, and what works in our own life. And, we'll dive into all of those different pieces, but we need to remember that there is always some sort of fear tactic involved with a lot of these docuseries on Netflix. And it all goes back to, who is trying to get a specific message out there. And there's a lot of fear around eating, and we never want to bring fear into our nutrition. So it's a whole thing that we need to kind of investigate.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I feel like we've become this culture of, I don't know, that centers around fear mongering, especially when it comes to the foods that we're eating. And unfortunately, I think that's leading to a lot of food anxiety and disordered eating for many people. So definitely worth discussing. So just high level, again, this twin study published in JAMA, it's an article about the cardiometabolic effects of vegan diets as compared to omnivorous diets in identical twins. Now, a strength of this study and why it's gotten a lot of attention is because it was conducted in twins. And in doing so, it eliminates genetic factors as confounding variable, right? So that's why I think a lot of eyes are on this particular study. So again, this was a clinical trial with 42 participants. Researchers followed the participants for 8 weeks. And I'm just going to skip to the punchline, which is that they did find that the vegan diet, that those on the vegan diet saw modest improvements in weight loss, LDL-C, and something called TMAO levels, which was new to me. And I don't know, Meghann, if you want to explain what that is. But there were no significant differences in HDL, blood pressure, or other cardiovascular health outcomes. And Meghann, as you alluded to, there were some other limitations that we absolutely have to mention when discussing this study. So when I Googled it, TMAO, it stands for okay, do you know how to pronounce trimethylamine?
Trimethylamine.
Okay, thank you. N-oxide, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What is this?
So, you summarized it great, that it's a compound produced in our gut after microbes digest certain nutrients. So it's something that we're looking at to try to figure out if we're having different elevated levels of this, which could potentially lead to some sort of, decrease in cardiac health in the long run. So it's something we would never have drawn if we go to the doctor, right? We know that if we go to the doctor, we're going to have our total cholesterol. We're going to have our LDL, which is quote unquote bad cholesterol. We're going to have our HDL, which is our protective or our healthy or good cholesterol. So this TMAO, while it's interesting to me, at the same time, it's more of a research level than something that any of us would ever have drawn going to the doctor.
Interesting. So can you walk through some of, the study design in terms of, and also the findings, in terms of some of the cognitive outcomes? And I think the punchline there is that they didn't actually detect any changes because it was such a short study period, but also maybe any changes detected in microbiome, some of the blood work that was done. Can you take us through this a little bit?
Yeah. So, taking a little bit of a step back, I'd heard from a lot of folks that they were very interested on my take on watching this docuseries. So I actually watched the docuseries before I pulled up the JAMA article to read it. So I kind of had my conclusions after listening to the actual Netflix series, and then went ahead and dove into the research article. And I was shocked to find that half of the things that they were pushing as big variables and big wins on the Netflix series were not even reported in the actual scientific study, which tells us that it was not statistically significant, that this was not actually something that they found as as a variable that we could publish in a very reputable scientific journal, such as JAMA. So it was just kind of sensationalized on Netflix. So, I thought that was a very interesting piece. So back to, what we said at the beginning, that we were drawing lab work on cardiac health, but then also our gut microbiome. There was a big push on our gut microbiome and going vegan, and that didn't make the cut for the final research study. So, was that actually something that we were able to prove was beneficial over these 8 weeks, or was it not? So it was interesting to kind of see some of the differences between what was discussed at length. There was also a lot of discussion on sexual function and arousal in the Netflix documentary. And again, that was not published in JAMA whatsoever. So there's clearly an entertainment value in a lot of the stuff that they're publishing on Netflix, which, we wouldn't expect someone who's watching a Netflix documentary to also pull the journal article and read how reputable is all of these things. So that's, why we're here today, to talk a little bit more about that.
Right. And that's such an important point, because there were a few things right off the bat when I started watching the series that struck me as, this does not pass the smell test. So right off the bat, and I don't know if I'm mispronouncing his name, but Dr. Michael Grieger, he's a doctor, I believe he's a GP, and he's a known promoter of the vegan diet. He's on the screen saying things that just frankly are not evidence-based. And just side note, he was also in some other Netflix documentaries whose overarching message was also promoting a plant-based diet and basically deterring people from eating animal products. And these were The Game Changers and What the Health. So he says things like too much dairy increases the risk for Parkinson's disease, as well as prostate cancer. I have not seen any credible human data that actually confirms any sort of causal association between those things. He also says that the number one cause of death in the U.S. is the American diet, which is really kind of extrapolating from the fact that the number one cause of death in the U.S. is heart disease, and where diet is certainly a contributing factor, it is not the sole factor. So I am with you. There are a lot of things that raise some red flags for me. So Meghann, can you take us through some of the funding for this study and why that's something that we might want to flag for folks, just in an attempt to be totally transparent?
Absolutely. So when I look at a research study, I'm like, who funded this, right? Was there a piece of this that was funded by somebody that potentially had a mission or something that they wanted to spread, that they could skew the research a little bit to show that? So when we look at who funded this research study, it was funded by the Vote Foundation, which is a private foundation that supports oceanic preservation, amongst, some other causes as well. And then also Christopher Gardner, who's the director of nutrition studies at Stanford, which is funded by the Beyond Meat, which is a vegan product. And then, so I think sometimes we see these people putting money into a specific research project in order to push a specific message that we're trying to get across there. So while, research studies are validated in multiple different ways by, peer reviews and things like that, we can also see that it can be skewed by who is actually funding it. So I think it's always important that we take a look at that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So let's talk about what the study found. So yes, the vegan twins did have a greater reduction in LDL-C, which is the quote unquote bad cholesterol, but their HDL or good cholesterol also went down more than the omnivores. And the vegans' triglycerides ended up far higher than the omnivores. And in fact, the only metrics that were significant between the two groups were LDL-C, insulin, and weight, although both groups lost weight. And it also worth noting that the vegan twins lost more muscle mass than the omnivorous twins, which seems concerning. Can you comment on some of these outcomes?
Absolutely. And this was what was the most fascinating to me. So I think we can break this down into the heart health, or the LDL piece, and then the weight piece. So we can kind of talk about that separately. But so when we're looking at overall cardiac risk and cardiac health, one of the big things that we're checked for on our yearly basis when we go to our preventative exam is cholesterol and LDL. So we know when our LDL cholesterol is high that it increases our risk of coronary events. So we want to try to keep that under 100. We also know from significant years of research that the more plants we eat and the less saturated fat we eat, the better our LDL. Saturated fat, it comes from animals. The majority of the saturated fat that we eat is in animals. And then there's also some in palm oil and in coconut oil, which would be vegan sources. So we know that when we decrease the amount of saturated fat in our diet and when we increase the amount of plants that we're eating, that is the best thing that we can do to lower that LDL and to improve our total cholesterol. So it makes sense that we saw that in these vegan diets. So when we look at the actual protocol, so it was an 8-week study. So for the first 4 weeks, the people on the vegan diet were given food. So they were given food that was lower in saturated fat, that, was all plant-based so that they could eat that. And then the final 4 weeks, they were educated on how they could continue that themselves. So we know for a fact that the way that they were eating, at least for the first 4 weeks, was significantly lower in saturated fat and had more plants. And we cannot argue that. Vegan diet, omnivore diet, we cannot argue that less saturated fat and more plants is phenomenal for our overall heart health, which to me, that's what this proved. That's exactly what we saw here from the heart health standpoint.
Right. So you're, just to make sure I'm clear, so you're basically reiterating that, yeah, it's great that when we incorporate produce into our diets, it's great. We need to have, I don't know, not plant exclusive diets is what I'm hearing, but plant-based. Was it still a plant-based diet if you're an omnivore? I don't know what the proper phrasing is, but I'm saying, sorry.
There's so many terms. Yeah. We could be more plant-based, but still eat dairy, still eat fish, still eat certain meats, but that we prioritize plants. There's so many different terms for it. I think it's just finding what works for us. But
so just taking a step back for 1 second, we're going to get back into the documentary and the study in a moment. But if I'm a client of yours, let's say, and I tell you I'm considering going strictly vegan, what would you say to me?
I would ask why. What's our reasoning? Why are we interested in doing this? So I work with plenty of clients that are vegan for ethical reasons. That makes sense, right? If we truly believe that, harming animals is against, everything in our being, then let's not do it. You know what I mean? But why do we want to do this? Do we want to go vegan because we think that that's the healthiest option for our body? That's where I'm going to be like, are we sure? So as you mentioned, I'm a runner. I work with a lot of very, very, very active humans. So I'm like, where are we going to get our protein? Are you willing to eat tofu, tempeh, beans, lentils, a cup and a half of lentils at a meal? And they're like, wait, what? What do I have to do to get my protein? And there are some people who, for ethical reasons, are like, yes, of course I will eat that, right? So that's a different conversation to me than someone who's literally just trying to live a healthier lifestyle and thinks that by going vegan, that's going to get them healthier. That's where I kind of want to have that conversation.
I love the way that you approach that. And you touched on something that got me thinking. There are seeds of truth in the docuseries, right? They do talk about things. They raise concerns about like animal welfare, which you mentioned here. And as an animal lover, those things are very important to me. And I know a lot of people will call me a hypocrite. How could you be an animal lover if you're consuming meat? Of course, I do take steps to make sure that the meat that I'm getting is, locally sourced and as humanely treated as possible and all that good stuff. But of course, that's imperfect. And I do understand, when folks raise that as a concern. They also talked about food deserts in the docuseries. And I thought we should talk about that. Food deserts are absolutely a real thing. There are folks who do have limited access to fresh foods, fresh produce, whole foods. And that is problematic, right? Food deserts do exist. We know that they tend to be in areas of lower socioeconomic status and certain communities within the U.S. So can we just take a moment to talk about processed foods? And again, like I said, we've covered this in detail. I think this would mean a lot coming from you, given your expertise. Would you say that it is okay every now and then to have processed foods, and yes, even ultra processed foods? What do you think about that?
I do. I think there's a place for all of them. I mean, I will never go for a run without eating graham crackers beforehand, and that's probably considered an ultra processed food, right? There's a place for all of them. And I think you bring up a really good point that in order to execute a vegan diet in a very, very healthy, balanced way, it's a privilege to have the money and the resources to be able to execute it that way. So, one of my biggest things is, to your point, with these food deserts, we need to be getting adequate nutrition. We need to eat a vegetable. We need to try to not snack on chips and maybe know what an apple, eat an apple for that snack. That's a win in a lot of situations in our country. So I think to take these stances of like, no ultra processed foods, only plant-based, like that has to be a privilege for us to have access to those items, to be and the cost that comes along with some of those things, right? Some plant-based foods like lentils are incredibly economical. But when we're looking at some of the products they were pushing in this docuseries, it was very expensive vegan cheese,
right.
So I think like we need to understand that.
Well, and it's also so extreme. And I have said this, till I'm blue in the face, I'm very opposed to very all or none black and white statements. Life is about the gray, and we have to be realistic. even this morning, running out the door as I'm getting my kids to school, you better believe I grabbed a granola bar, right? Because that's what that's all I could have in that moment. So I get very, I don't know, up in arms when I hear this like guilting or shaming about, the things that we're eating. So it's, as you said, Meghann, it's, it's all about balance and look at the totality of our diet. You certainly try to increase plant intake, produce, get your fruits and veggies, even if they're canned or frozen, right? Do your best to eat less saturated fat, eat more whole grains, fiber. We know that these things are important. So let me ask you this. Are vegan foods automatically healthier for us than the alternative?
No, absolutely not.
So can we talk about that? I think everyone knows ahead of every episode, we jot down some notes to help outline here. And I see, you have some notes here about different types of burgers, and you break things down in terms of fat, saturated fat, protein. Can we talk through some of that?
Yeah. So if we are leading into more plant-based products, as I mentioned, some really phenomenal sources of protein on a plant-based diet are going to be lentils, are one of our highest sources of protein. Soy, so whether it's soy milk, tofu, tempeh, things like that, they're going to have the highest amount of protein per weight. But then we get into a lot of people moving to a vegan diet because we think it's healthier. So I want my burger. Right? I want my chicken strips. So when we start to manufacture some of these quote unquote fake protein products, what we end up finding is that we're putting a lot of palm oil and coconut oil into it. Into our earlier conversation, though, yes, they're plant-based, but those are saturated fats that raise that LDL. So it's interesting to me to compare, like, say, a beef burger with a Beyond Burger, with an Impossible Burger. And the thing that strikes me is total fat, but then also that saturated fat, because we know that that's what raises LDL. So a 4-ounce beef burger is going to have 22 grams of fat and 8 grams of saturated fat. An Impossible Burger has 14 grams of fat, so a little less, but also 8 grams of saturated fat. And then a Beyond Burger has 18 grams of fat and 6 grams of saturated fat. So from my perspective, if we're trading red meat for a bunch of these products on a weekly basis multiple times, we may not actually be doing anything better for our health. Now, if it's an environmental thing, that's a different conversation. But if it's for our actual health, it might not be any different.
That's so important. People are often, vilifying certain things and then talking about replacing them with other things and not considering what the potential impacts of the replacement are. So I'm so glad that you raised that. So a couple of other things I wanted to flag. Took a bunch of notes about the docuseries. They did raise one other thing that I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least touch upon briefly. They talk about conflicts of interest among the dietary guidelines committees and how, yes, there are agricultural lobbyists that may influence the construction of these guidelines. I think that that's accurate. I think that, that's something that people should be aware of. But again, I don't think that's a reason that we necessarily go vegan, right? There's some truth there, but I don't see how that necessarily blanketly supports a vegan diet. Then there were some blatant misinformation. So they overstated, and I don't remember exactly what the statistic was, but they overstated greenhouse gases from the agricultural sector. I believe they made a direct comparison to the transportation sector and said that the greenhouse gases from the agricultural sector were like more than double that of the transportation sector, which is simply not accurate. And I can pull the statistic and tag it in our show notes. They also overstate the use of antibiotics and antimicrobials in livestock farming. While, yes, they are used. In the docuseries, they said that more antibiotics and antimicrobials are used in farming than in humans. And so while that may be true, that completely ignores the important detail that there are more animals and plants. So we would expect them to be used more in animals and plants if there are more of them than humans. Sorry, I totally botched that. Does that make sense, Meghann? Or
No, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
They also really vilify farmed fish and say, they were saying like you throw them in the garbage because they only contain bad oils. Can you talk about this? Let's talk about fish for a moment and fish in our diets. Can you comment on that?
It did break my heart a little bit because, I mean, I live in Ohio. Like, I'm landlocked. We don't have good fish here. I guess we do have a Great Lakes to our north. But, for a lot of people, choosing a white fish, choosing some farm-raised salmon is probably significantly better than choosing, an 80-20 beef patty. So, and not to mention just exposure. So in order to get some of these items to different places in the United States, like we can't overfish the seas. We don't have access to these types of things. So it breaks my heart a little bit to see that being vilified the way that it is. The other thing that really came to mind with this is they took the worst of the pork farms, of the beef farms, of the, farmed fish. Like literally, there's a bad seed in every single industry. And it was like, we're going to pull the 3 bad seeds here and it looked disgusting. It looked awful in this documentary, but that doesn't mean that every single farmed fish, that every single pork, farm is this despicable. Mm-hmm. And, specifically to the nutrition of farmed fish, a lot of them are lower in mercury than eating, the fish out in the sea. So that would be a benefit. And then it just depends on what we feed those fish. So if we're feeding those fish, crummy food items, of course the macronutrient profile isn't going to be as phenomenal as something raised in the sea. So what we see is that farmed fish is a little bit like, let's use salmon for an example. It's a little bit lower in omega-3s than what we would find, fresh in the sea. So there might be, a little bit of difference in quality there. But at the end of the day, it's still a fairly decent option compared to other things.
So can we talk now a little bit about the microbiome and some of the claims made about the microbiome in the docuseries? This is sort of, this to me, it's like the buzzword du jour is microbiome. Everyone's talking about the microbiome. And the reality is, we don't know what we don't know about the microbiome, right? We're just starting to understand the microbiome. And look, I have my little seltzer here. I'm going to take a sip. I'm going to alter my microbiome. Some of the changes to the microbiome are completely temporary and fleeting and insignificant to our health, but people will claim, oh, this changes your microbiome in an attempt to scare us. So do you happen to recall some of the claims made around the microbiome? I think that can you chat about that?
Well, the biggest thing for me was there was a lot of talk about the microbiome in the docuseries, and there was nothing in the actual study, because that's what I went for. I was like, I wanted to see body composition changes, like muscle and fat mass, not just weight change. And I wanted to see microbiome changes. And we saw neither in the actual study. So, that's what tells me, and to your point, I'm not saying they didn't find good data. They might have, but we just don't know yet. We are like on the tip of the iceberg about, okay, maybe this helps, maybe this doesn't, but we still don't understand. It's such a complex organism, our GI tract, so we just don't totally understand it. And clearly there was nothing that was able to be published about this data. So it really makes you question, what actually happened within there. And I didn't pull anything incredibly meaningful from the actual docuseries.
Got it. And what about, wasn't there some mention of our biological clock and that
yes.
age more quickly when we're on a when we eat an omnivorous diet. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah. And now that you say that, I can't even remember what they were basing that off of, but there was at the very end, a lot of biological clock. That's right. It was something about the telomeres.
Yes.
They were looking at your actual DNA with that. Yeah. And I mean, that's definitely not my specialty along that area. And again, didn't make the final cut in JAMA. So I have to believe that it wasn't anything that was too statistically significant.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess the bottom line for me that I want people to walk away from is that this is, first of all, it's one small study that has its limitations. I mean, we talked about some of the potential conflicts of interest with some of the, the funding and that, that angle. Although actually, sorry, was the funding, was that just for the docuseries or was that for the actual study? Now I'm mixing, that
was definitely for the docuseries.
So maybe it was just the docuseries.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
I have to pull up the study.
Yes, I will have to pull the study. Oh gosh, I should have had that before I started opening up my mouth. But regardless, this was a small study. Only 21 or 22 twins actually finished the study. They were only followed for 8 weeks. I mean, this is not grounds for completely revamping your diet, right?
Right.
So if someone is making these, I mean, and it's okay to consider dietary changes. Obviously, it should be a conversation to be had with a health or medical professional. What are some of the things that you would want people to sort of be aware of as they're thinking about making these changes, or what are considerations that they should have?
So I want somebody to take a look at what does my nutrition look like right now and what are my goals? So again, we cannot argue that most of us need to eat more fruits and vegetables. So let's do it, right? Let's add more of those things in. And then let's take a look at our protein. How are we doing with our protein? And can we decrease the saturated fat from which we're choosing protein? Can we lean on some more plant-based proteins? Can we choose some leaner protein sources? Can we get some fish into our diet? So I don't think we necessarily have to cut anything out of our diet unless we're actually allergic to something in order to be healthier. We just need to understand, what am I like now? Get to your primary care provider, have yearly blood work done, know your genetics if you have the privilege of understanding what your ancestors struggled with, whether it was diabetes or high cholesterol or hypertension. So you are aware of some of the areas we need to pay attention to, because nutrition can be a very powerful tool to help us manage or prevent having some of those different conditions. But we need to be aware of that. And then we need to understand that there are multiple ways to improve those types of things. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, like a vegan diet could potentially be for someone if that's what they're choosing. And then the other thing is, talking about the body composition changes a little bit from this study. Yes, we saw people lose weight, but when we looked at it, the muscle mass loss amongst the vegans was significantly greater than the omnivorous diet. So we want to be very smart, because we know that the quality of protein in animal-based proteins is not quite as high. It's not quite as high in an amino acid called leucine, which triggers our muscles to regenerate, to recover, to rebuild on a daily basis. So if chronically we don't have enough leucine in our diet, we see premature muscle loss. That's also what we saw in this over these 8 weeks. We saw that these people on a vegan diet were losing more muscle mass because they weren't accounting for getting enough protein. So it's really important, if we do want to lean more plant-based, we have to be very smart about how much protein we're getting in, because we have to eat excess or plant-based protein in order to get enough total protein per meal. So it ends up being a little bit of a commitment to try to figure that out.
So are there any people for whom you would recommend a vegan diet, or not necessarily?
Honestly, I think it needs to be our own personal choice. I would never tell someone you have to go vegan. Mm-hmm. I just don't think that that's my place to put that on someone. I want to help people live their healthiest lifestyle in the way that they want to live. If we tell someone how to eat, what not to eat, that lasts for a week or two. It doesn't last forever. So we need to work within the constraints of someone's own choices and availability and socioeconomic status to figure out, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. What works here? Because that's what's going to go for the long term. We can do anything in the short term,
Right.
4 weeks, 8 weeks, like this study, but can we stick to it for the long term? That's where we see health benefits.
Right. Oh, that's such a good point. So any final thoughts for folks who watch this docuseries and are like, this really got me thinking that maybe a vegan diet is superior. And obviously we talked through a lot of the considerations, but just any takeaways or anything that we didn't talk about that you'd want to mention?
I think it's just so important to understand that these are sensationalized, right? So they're going to be a very extreme vantage point on what's happening here. So don't allow that to totally impact your decisions. I think when we see it, we're like, oh my gosh, I need to change something. Calm down. Think about it. Think about your lifestyle. Like we said, think about your own health goals. Think about your own current health and what do we need to do to make that a little bit better. And maybe it is inserting more plants into our life. Like I said, we cannot argue that most of us need more plants. So let's do it. Let's add some more plants in. Let's decrease the saturated fat. Let's maybe decrease the animal protein and increase some of the plant-based protein. But I want people to understand that in order to be healthy, it does not have to be all or nothing. It does not have to be black and white. It has to be what's going to work for you in the long term.
Right. And I guess bottom line is the people who produced the docuseries are human, right? They have their own opinions and preconceived notions. And I guess where the problem lies is when those opinions masquerade as scientific facts. And I think we pointed out a few things here that are sort of, evidence of clear bias or distorted information and in certain instances, blatant misinformation. So take it with a grain of salt, pun intended. I don't know. But anyway, diet pun. Yeah.
Nailed that.
Nailed it. All right. Well, Meghann, thank you so much for your time and expertise. Thank you all for tuning in today. We hope you found this interesting and you enjoyed walking through this docuseries with us. Special thanks to Meghann Featherstun. Definitely make sure that you follow her at Featherstone Nutrition. I will link to all of her socials and website and everything in our show notes. In the meantime, we will continue to share infographics to the Unbiased Science social media channels. So be sure to give a follow at Unbiased SciPod. Also want to give a shameless plug for my new podcast, Bites of Health. That's Bites with a Y, BYTES. This is a 5-minute podcast that airs daily. I co-host it with two amazing and hilarious pediatricians. We bring on lots of guest pediatricians to discuss and answer commonly asked pediatric questions, like I said, in 5 minutes or less. So go check out Bites of Health, and you can follow along at Bites of Health Pod. Again, that's Bites with a Y. As always, it's super helpful if you consider leaving us a review on Apple or wherever you're tuning in. If you're watching this on YouTube, hello, please be sure to subscribe to the Unbiased Science channel. Remember, there's also a Substack newsletter. It's free to subscribe, but if you're willing and able, paid subscriptions are much appreciated. Sincere thanks for tuning in and following along as we share no nonsense, just science.